Bart, who I'm not going to introduce because he was introduced to yesterday, except, as you all know, he is somebody who has beavered away doing very detailed research, often on things that are not so well covered, particularly some aspects of the military programme. And Bart has been doing a lot of research on the new potential military satellite programs. I don't know if that's the best way to introduce them, but I'm going to let Bart go ahead when he's ready there. Thanks.
Yes. Keep talking, Brian. do a song and then just go through those slides verbally again.
I think that's what
And when I'm doing that.
Just used to working with
Put yours over the top. I've been told by some experienced computer operator that if you do that, it works. If it doesn't work, it's his fault. No, it did work. You're all right. Okay.
Okay, I'll be talking today about sleuthing Russian military satellites. I'll mainly be talking about something that I've been spending quite a lot of time on in recent months, and that is to find out as much as possible about Russian military satellites from internet sources. Because it turns out that many of these Russian military satellites leave a paper trail on the internet, and if you know where to look for it, you can find it. But that's something, of course, that we can do now in the internet era. It's something we didn't do back in the Soviet days. I'll first talk briefly about the other techniques that we can use to find out more about Russian military satellites, techniques that we've been using since the Soviet days and that we can continue to use today. Okay, so let's go to the next one. And that is orbital analysis, visual and radio observation. So those are techniques we've been using since the Soviet days and that we can continue to use today. What did the Russians tell us about their military satellite launches back in the Soviet days? Well, officially, of course, the Soviet Union did not have a military space program, but the Russians did announce every single military satellite launch, which was, of course, given a Cosmos number, like here, Cosmos 955. It was a standard announcement, so it said that the satellite carried a scientific equipment for the further exploration of space. That was its official goal. But more importantly, each TASS announcement gave us the orbital parameters of the satellite. So you see here the orbital period, the apogee, perigee, and the inclination of the orbit, and that usually told us what the satellite was going to do. In this particular case, we could be pretty sure that this was an electronic intelligence satellite of the Tsalina D series, which it indeed turned out to be when the Russians started releasing information on these satellites in the 1990s. What is the situation right now? The Russians no longer have these TASS press statements on their military launches. The only thing we get now is an official statement from the Ministry of Defense that a satellite has been launched in the interests of the Ministry of Defense, and that's it. No orbital parameters, nothing. The Russians do eventually register these launches with the United Nations, giving the orbital parameters, but that's not weeks or months until after they're launched. Fortunately, we have something that Phil is also very fond of, the two-line orbital elements, which are released, I understand, by the US Strategic Command, and which you can find on a website called Space Track. Right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That's right. I can't make much sense of these, but fortunately we have people like Phil who can...
It's a bit wrong, yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Fortunately we have people like Phil and Sven who can turn this into understandable English for us. But so the Americans released the orbital elements of Russian military satellites within hours after launch. Not the Russians themselves, but the Americans do release this type of information. On two occasions in recent years, the two-line orbital elements have even allowed us to identify military satellites that the Russians did not announce, which is quite unusual for them, actually. There were two launches back in 2013 and 2014, which put a trio of military communication satellites into orbit, which you can see on the lower end here. And these were officially announced. They were given Cosmos numbers. But then it turned out from the two-line orbital elements that there was also a fourth object associated with these launches, which the Russians had not announced. And it was not just a piece of debris, because these things started maneuvering. So we could be pretty sure that these were operational satellites. And it was not until several months later that the Russians registered these launches with the United Nations, and indeed it turned out for the first mission that there was a fourth object, which they later called Cosmos 2491 with hindsight. And this is one of the infamous Inspector satellites that Phil talked about yesterday. So the two-line elements come in very handy. I should add here that the Americans, US Strategic Command, does not release the same type of orbital information for American top secret satellites, like the ones launched by the National Reconnaissance Office. So the only way of finding out in what kind of orbits American military satellites are circling is by doing visual observations. And there's a whole network of satellite watchers, amateur satellite watchers around the world who have made a hobby of doing this, trying to find top secret American military satellites, like the NOS, Navy Ocean Surveillance satellites, which are now flying in pairs these days. They used to fly in trios. Now they have pairs of these satellites orbiting the Earth. We don't really need that for the Russian satellites, because the Americans give us the orbital parameters of the Russian satellites, but still these visual observations of Russian satellites can also be quite useful, because the brightness of these satellites in the night sky can obviously tell us something about their size. And we would very much like to get good visual observations of the three Matryoshka satellites that Phil talked about yesterday. We have a couple, but we need more, actually, to get some more firm data. Some of the satellite watchers have very sophisticated optical equipment, which allows them to zoom in on these satellites when they fly over. And they have obtained some remarkable images. This is a series of images of the American radar reconnaissance satellite La Crosse 5, where you can clearly see some design features. It's probably the radar or the solar panels, I don't know. Anyway, you can sort of get an idea of what the satellites look like. And similar images have been made of Russian military satellites as well. This is an image made by a guy called John Locker back in 2008 of a satellite called Cosmos 2441, which is one of their latest generation optical reconnaissance satellites called Persona or Quartz. And you can make out some details. And John Locker then made an artist's impression based on this image. And it looks a bit like a mini Hubble Space Telescope looking back at the ground. And as we will see in a couple of moments, this is probably a quite accurate representation of this satellite. And apart from the satellite observations, we have the radio observations, which Sven Gran, of course, talked about in detail yesterday, and people are continuing to do this. For instance, some amateurs have picked up signals from these Inspector satellites. Some of them turn out to have some kind of radio amateur payload on board, so this work is also continuing. Not on the same scale, I think, as it was in the Soviet days under the Kettering Group, but people are continuing to do that as well. In many cases, we have a very good idea of what Russian military satellites look like, because in many cases, the Russians have built civilian satellites based on the military satellites. And so we can be pretty confident, or we have a very good idea what the military satellites look like. A very obvious example, of course, were the Zenit spy satellites back in the Soviet days, which had the same design as the Vostok capsules. Instead of a cosmonaut, they carried reconnaissance cameras. You can't really say which was derived from which here, because they were both conceived simultaneously back in the late 1950s for dual purposes. Another example from the Soviet days, back in the late 1970s, the Russians started launching these satellites, which they officially announced as Okean, and these were intended for monitoring the oceans. And they were launched or put in exactly the same orbits as a series of Cosmos satellites, which were believed to be ELINT, electronic intelligence satellites. So we could be pretty sure, pretty confident that the Okeans had the same design as these military ELINT satellites. And that indeed turned out to be the case, again, when the Russians started releasing information about these satellites in the 1990s. Similarly, in the 1990s, the Russians announced a new series of astrophysical satellites called Spectre. And these were derived from their second generation early warning satellites called USKMO. I don't think we realized that at the time. It was not until later, until after the turn of the century, that we realized this. So the same logic can be applied to military satellites that the Russians are currently flying. For instance, one type of satellite they occasionally launch is a trio of military communication satellites called Radnik or Strela 3M. And these have a civilian spin-off called Ganets-M. This one is used for civilian communications. And we can be very sure that Radnik looks almost exactly the same. Same thing for their spy satellites. The Russians have announced a new series of civilian remote sensing satellites called Resurs PM, and they have released drawings of these now. And we can be quite confident that they are derived from the currently orbiting Persona Quartz spy satellites. And this drawing, which I just showed, was made back in 2008. This drawing was released not very long ago, and we do see that John Locker probably was quite correct in well, this artist's impression is very close to reality. There is a difference, though, in the configuration of the solar panels. I don't know if that's significant, but they do seem to have the same configuration. But let's turn now to what I'll be focusing on mainly today, and that is the use of online sources of information to find out more about Russian military satellites. Turns out that with some perseverance, a little knowledge of Russian, you can really find an awful lot on the internet, which is quite remarkable. I don't think the same goes for American military satellites. I haven't really researched those all that much, but I can't imagine you can find as much on American military satellites than you can on Russian military satellites. Pretty much all we know about the top secret American military satellites being flown today is based on the visual observations and also on the information that was leaked by Edward Snowden a couple of years ago, who then of course fled to Russia and is now safely hiding somewhere in Moscow. Fortunately, you don't have to be an Edward Snowden to find out information about Russian military satellites. Even amateurs like me can find quite a lot of interesting stuff. I have divided this as follows: company publications, procurement documents, court documents, press reports and online forums, and finally pictures that the Russians occasionally release. Company publications, I'm talking here about things like official histories, websites, general and technical articles, annual reports produced by Russian space companies, patents that are put online, and PhD dissertations. And I will give examples of each of those right now. First of all, official histories. Many Russian companies, design bureaus, publish histories, and these will mainly tell you things about the Soviet-era military satellites, but some of these publications also talk about current Russian military satellites, which may be surprising, but that is indeed the case. This is a history of a company called Tsnirty, which is an institute based in Moscow, which has had a monopoly for many years in building payloads for signal intelligence satellites, electronic intelligence satellites. This publication has a whole chapter on their latest ELINT satellites called Liana. It even has images of the payload. What you will not find, though, are they will not say anything about the actual capabilities of these payloads. So they will not tell you which kind of signals they can pick up, but they will give you an awful lot of other technical details. Quite interesting. The only problem is that it's quite difficult to obtain these publications. They have limited print runs. You will not find them in the bookshops in Moscow. They're mainly intended for distribution among company employees. Fortunately, some of these people are kind enough to put these books online. Thank you very much. Sometimes it's enough to go to websites of companies. You may not think that's possible, but it is. This is from the website of KB Arsenal, which is a design bureau based in St. Petersburg, which builds the buses for these electronic intelligence satellites. And just go to their website and you will see some basic information and drawings of the latest generation of Russian early warning, electronic intelligence satellites, the Liana satellites and the Pion satellites. So it turns out that some of these military satellites have a lower level of classification than other satellites, other military satellites, and I don't know why. Then there's all kinds of general and technical publications that we can consult to find out more about Russian military satellites. Many of the companies, the space design bureaus, have their in-house magazines, which they put online. This, for instance, is the Vestnik magazine of MPO Lavochkin, which is best known for building interplanetary probes, but it does a lot of other stuff as well. And this is from a recent issue published last year. It's published quarterly, so this is the last issue of 2017, and it has a whole article about a spy satellite proposed at the beginning of this century, so not very, very long ago, which is quite surprising. Now, of course, not all the companies have these in-house journals. Most specialists working for these design bureaus will publish their technical papers in all kinds of obscure magazines, which you will find, which are very difficult to find. Fortunately, there is a website where you can get a very good overview of these technical publications. It's called elibrary.ru, so it's like an electronic library. And I can just enter the name of a design bureau there and get an overview of all the technical papers that have been published by this design bureau in recent months and years. This is just one example. So what kind of information do you get? You get the authors here, you get their affiliations. There's two design bureaus here, NEAT and KB Tochmash, and you will get a brief abstract of the article. And if you're lucky, you may find the complete article on the internet. This one is, as you can see here, is about a star tracker. Now, it's a very technical article with lots of mathematical formulas that I don't understand. But using information from other sources, it has become possible to determine that this star tracker is probably intended for a new generation of anti-satellite weapons that Russia is currently developing. Of course, the article won't say that. That's typical for these technical articles. They will give you a very detailed technical description of this star tracker, but they will not tell you for which satellite it's intended. But using, again, other sources of information, that's the conclusion you can draw. All companies in Russia are obliged by law to publish annual reports, giving an overview of the things they've been doing in the past year. Some of the companies put these annual reports online, others don't. Don't ask me why. This is the annual report, or unannual report, of a company called MPP Kvant, which produces solar panels for Russian satellites. And this is one page from that annual report, which provides us with some interesting information. Here you can see the production code 14F150, which is one of the mystery Matryoshka satellites that Phil talked about yesterday. And what this tells you is that its solar panels have a total area of 4.6 square meters, which tells you something about the size of the satellite. It also mentions a satellite called Technolog, probably something military. It's not mentioned anywhere else. Still haven't figured out what that is. It also talks about Razdan, which is their next generation optical reconnaissance satellite. So we can tell that this company is producing solar panels for that top secret military satellite. And then there's patents. People working for these companies, if they come up with new inventions, they want to protect these inventions by, how do you say, they're putting patents on them, or what's they put?
Just
patenting them, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can find all of these patents online. This is a patent which is officially called, I think, a new satellite bus for a remote sensing satellite. So it won't tell you for which project it's actually intended. But again, using other sources of information, it became possible to determine that this is the bus for the latest generation of military topographic imaging mapping satellites called BARS-M. And this is from a PhD dissertation. So many of these design bureaus have close ties with Russian universities, and people working for these design bureaus or hoping to work for design bureaus often write PhD dissertations, which again you can find on the internet. And this is from a PhD dissertation describing a number of optical payloads for Russian satellites. This one is called Karat. The PhD dissertation will not tell you for which project this is intended, but again, it was possible to determine that this is the camera which is being used on that military topographic imaging or mapping satellite. So that's so much for the company publications. Then there's procurement documents, and there's really two types of procurement documents. Some companies put online their procurement plans for the next few months or for the next year, and these often contain information about military satellites. But more importantly, there's this very nice website which is called zakupki.gov.ru. Zakupki means purchases in Russian. And what you can find there are contracts signed by companies all over Russia, not just space-related companies, just any company. So there's a field here called Zakashik, which means, well, something like prime contractor. So you can enter the name of the prime contractor here. You press on this button, Найти, find, and you will get a whole list of contracts signed by this company in well, recent months or years. Most of those contracts are not space related. You will find anything there, from the delivery of toilet paper, food products, to I don't know, anything. Of course, fortunately, you can narrow down the search using this field. Here you can enter a keyword which you want to see in the name of the contract. So something like camera or whatever. And that sometimes produces interesting results. What you will not get here are the big contracts between the Ministry of Defense and the prime contractor. So you won't find stuff like that. That obviously is highly classified. But what you will find here are contracts about subsystems of military satellites signed between the prime contractor and the subcontractor, or between individual subcontractors. This is just one example. This is from a contract about the delivery of an optical camera system for the next generation spy satellites, Razdan. Why do the Russians allow these kinds of documents to appear online? I don't know. But if you know where to look for them, it just takes 3 or 4 clicks on the computer mouse to find them. It's as easy as that. So apparently the Russians are so naive to think that people cannot find this, or people are not interested in finding this kind of information. It's amazing. I can't imagine you could find such contracts about American military satellites. So it's And then there's core documents. So the prime contractors sign contracts with subcontractors. If the subcontractors fail to deliver equipment on time, they may be sued by the prime contractor. And some of the documents related to that appear online. This is, again, one example. This is a contract related to a top secret satellite called Neutron, which means neutron. It's being built by the NPO Машиностроения company, which is the former Chalamet design bureau. It's a satellite which is going to be launched for the first time, apparently later this year. Top secret, we don't really know what it's going to do. Maybe military radar reconnaissance, but we can't tell for sure. But here, NPO Машиностроения is suing NPO Lavachkin for not having delivered certain equipment on time. That in itself is not very interesting, but what this document does tell us, for instance, is that the contract for the development of this satellite between the Ministry of Defense and the prime contractor was signed on the 27th of December 2011. And that is interesting. If you want to reconstruct the history of this project, you know that it officially began in December 2011. It also shows you when when Машиностроения, so the Chalamet Design Bureau, signed its contract with Lavachkin. That was in March 2013. What this also tells you is that this satellite will be inserted into orbit with the Fregat upper stage, which is being developed by NPO Lavachkin. So that's some key information that you can find out about this particular project, and it's all on the internet for anyone to see. So you can find it. Just enter Neutron, in Google and maybe a few other keywords like NPO machinestrojenie, and you will find this within a matter of seconds. Press reports, online forums, what I mean here is that sometimes, occasionally, information about Russian military satellites is leaked in the press or via online forums. Not very often, unfortunately. This is an example from a newspaper called Kommersant.ru, which is the online version of the Kommersant newspaper. In America, of course, Aviation Week used to be quite famous for that, which is why it got the nickname Aviation Leak. So they leaked a lot of information on military satellites. In Russia, that's mainly been this newspaper, and also Izvestia has had a couple of leaks on military satellites here and there. This particular article, written back in 2016, revealed the existence of a top-secret military satellite called Razdan, which is their next-generation digital optical reconnaissance satellite. It also gave us the production code, 14F156, and some additional information as well. And that was about 2-3 years ago. I haven't seen many of those leaks in recent years. That's the last one I can remember. So some of these newspaper journalists obviously have contacts within the Ministry of Defense or within the space industry who leak this kind of information to them. There's also the online forums, and I'm thinking mainly here about the online forum of Novosti Kosmonavtiki magazine, which is the most famous Russian space magazine. This is from a thread about Cosmos 2519. That's the mission that Phil talked about yesterday, the Matryoshka mission as it's been nicknamed. And until August last year, we didn't really know who the prime contractor was for this mission, who built the main satellite, which is, well, maybe 2519 or 2521. We didn't know that for sure. But then sometime in August last year, there was a guy writing under the pseudonym T.A.U. Tau, who said that the workforce of Lavochkin had been congratulated on successfully completing the first stage of flight tests of this mission. So that told us that MPO Lavochkin was the prime contractor for this highly secretive mission. Unfortunately, that is also now changing. I have noticed in recent weeks that the threads related to Russian military satellites on the NK forum have gone completely silent. People are not writing about military satellites anymore. I don't know why. They're afraid of something or somebody. And magazines like Novosti Kosmonavtiki are clearly also suffering from a new wave of censorship, which kind of reminds me of the Soviet days. This is from a very recent issue of Novosti Kosmonavtiki, which had a list of launches carried out last year in 2017, a very detailed list, even including all the small nano satellites deployed from the International Space Station. But there were a few blanks in this table. So you see here, that's a Chinese launch with the international designator 1775A. That's a failed launch from the Vostochny Cosmodrome last November.
Oh, yeah, that one.
And then we see 77A, which is another launch from China. Where is 76A? There's a blank line here. Well, that was a Russian military satellite launched last December. Cosmos, I can't remember now which one. But it was an Liana electronic intelligence satellite. So it was simply erased from this table. And that's kind of absurd because everybody knows that this satellite was launched. The Russians officially announced it last year. So this is, well, a kind of absurd type of censorship, which we now see in Novosti Kosmonavtiki, which again is very reminiscent of what we saw in the Soviet days. Well, not the Russian, in fact, back in the Soviet days, they did officially announce these launches. Now they're just erasing this from history. The reason for that appears to be that Novosti Kosmonavtiki is no longer an independent journal. It It is now owned by the Russian Space Agency, and obviously there are censors within the Russian Space Agency, or SNIMASH more particularly, who have decided that this kind of information cannot be published in an open Russian publication. But this is completely absurd, of course. In fact, Novosti Kosmonavtiki ran an article on this very launch in one of its earlier issues. Pictures, well, sometimes, this doesn't happen very often though, we can deduce things about military satellites just by looking at pictures. This is a picture released about a year ago. It was made during a visit of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to a company called ESS Reshitnyov in Krasnoyarsk, which is best known for building communications satellites. It's the Reshitnyov Design Bureau. And he was shown here looking at a board which shows a certain satellite. Now, if you zoom in on that board, you will see that it's called Ripey-S. And there's another one here called Ripey-V. You can just make out the Cyrillic letter V here. So there's two satellites, one intended for geostationary orbits and one intended for highly elliptical orbits. And the name, we had never seen the name Ripey before, so we could be quite confident that it was some kind of military satellite. And it turned out indeed this is very likely the next generation of Russian electronic intelligence satellites, which will circle the Earth in much higher orbits than the current Liana constellation. So apparently this photograph was released by the TASS news agency. You can still find it online. So obviously, the censors didn't notice this. That's the only explanation I can give. I will now give you an example of how it was possible to unmask a recently launched Russian military satellite using a combination of these techniques. The satellite was called is called Cosmos 2525. It was launched last March from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome using the Soyuz 21V rocket, the same rocket that launched the Matryoshka satellites, and which Phil showed in his presentation yesterday. But this is another mission than the Matryoshka mission. So this is an image of the launch. And all the Russians told us about this is it's a satellite launched in the interest of the Ministry of Defense. That was it. But by the time it was launched, we had a very good idea of what the satellite looked like and what its exact capabilities were. And I'll tell you that story now. It's a whole detective story. In fact, this launch was originally planned for late last year. It was delayed a couple of months, and it appeared on the Plesetsk launch schedule sometime last autumn. So people started getting interested in this mission. I mean, the people who are interested in Russian military satellites, at least. And one of those people was Stan Black, who is he's from Britain. He lives in Britain, and he regularly sends postings to the NASA Spaceflight Forum, which you're probably, or many of you are probably familiar with. He had found something interesting in the annual report of the VNIEM Corporation, VNIEM, which is best known for building Russian weather satellites, the Meteor weather satellites, and the Canopus civilian remote sensing satellites. There was one page in this report which summed up the missions that were going to be launched in 2017. So you see Meteor M, Canopus V, these are well-known civilian satellites. But there was one satellite here which was identified here as MK, which is a Russian acronym for, you can see it here, experimental small space apparatus. That's just a Russian word for satellite, space apparatus. That was interesting. We never heard of that before. So Stan Black then went to this zakupka.ru website where you can find all the contracts. So he just entered MK, I think. And what he came up with was this contract signed between the VNIEM Corporation and an aviation transport company called Volga-Dnieper. And this contract said that a satellite called MK, built by the VNIEM Corporation, was going to be transported to Plesetsk before the end of the year. So we could be quite confident that the payload for this top secret mission was MK. It also tells you here that the contract for the development of this satellite was signed in October 2015. So it's a project that got underway not very long ago. It took them just 2 years to build the satellite, which in Russian terms is quite short. Interestingly, a couple of weeks later, the Izvestia newspaper published a story about the MK satellite, and it was clearly based on what Stan Black had posted on the NASA Spaceflight Forum, although the article didn't really say that. And I've noticed this on other occasions as well. Phil talked about that yesterday as well. Some Russian journalists specializing in space keep a very close eye on these spaceflight forums, NASA Spaceflight Forum and the NK, the Novosti Kosmonavtiki online forum, and they write stories based on what people post there, not always mentioning the source. So this particular article mentioned exactly the same sources that Stan Black had given on the NASA Spaceflight Forum. The only additional information that we got here is that the launch had been delayed, and clearly these guys, these journalists, had used their contacts within the Ministry of Defense to confirm that MK was indeed the payload for this mission. So that was the only new information that was revealed in this particular article. I then started doing some detective work myself, and VNM Corporation has an in-house journal, an in-house magazine, which you can find online, which is published once every 4 months. And there was one article, I think it was back in 2014 or 15, which mentioned plans for future remote sensing satellites to be built by the VNM Corporation. So here you can see Canopus, which is a civilian satellite. Also included in this table was SkySat-1, which is a small American high-resolution optical imaging satellite. I didn't understand at that point why it was included in the table. But interestingly enough, it also showed 2 new satellites called Zvezda, which means star in Russian, and MKAV, which is an acronym for Small High Resolution Satellite. And Zvezda was said to be a precursor of the MKAV satellite. So that's the operational satellite, and this is the precursor, sort of prototype satellite, if you will. And so this article also gave the characteristics of the optical payload. It didn't say that it was a military satellite. It said that, among other things, it could be used for military purposes. So it was described as a dual-purpose satellite back in 2014, 2015. So then this was interesting. I had a name now, Zvezda. I entered the name Zvezda in Google together with VNM Corporation, and then I found some interesting articles, and also this website of a company called SKTB Plastic. And this website told us that this company had built a camera housing for a satellite called Zvezda, built by the VNM Corporation. So that told us what the camera housing looked like. Well, that's not all that interesting. It would be more interesting to find what the camera itself can do. And quite by accident, a couple of weeks later, I was reading an article about another Russian optical imaging satellite called ISS-55. This is now being cancelled. So it was proposed by the Reshetnev design here in Krasnoyarsk, but has now been cancelled. But this particular article also included a description of the optical payload that they were hoping to install on this satellite, and I saw this, and this rang a bell. Because if you compare the picture of the camera housing with this actual camera, you can see that it's a perfect fit. So at that point, I was quite sure that I had found the optical payload for this MK satellite. And this article, there was also an English article about this, an English language article about this camera, actually gave its capabilities. So what this told us is that MK is carrying a camera with a maximum resolution of 0.9 meters, right? So it turned out that this camera had been proposed for 2 competing satellite proposals. One satellite built by Reshetnev in Krasnoyarsk, and another satellite built by VNM Corporation in Moscow. And apparently what happened is that both these companies first went to the Russian Space Agency, asked the Russian Space Agency, are you interested in a small high-resolution optical imaging satellite? Roscosmos declined that offer, so they were not interested. And then these companies went to the Ministry of Defense and asked them, are you interested? And apparently the military were interested in these satellites, and they picked one of these two designs. So I must confess that we were helped in identifying this satellite by the fact that it originated as a civilian or a dual-purpose proposal, which then turned military later on. So that made it easier to identify this particular mission. At that point, we still didn't know what the satellite itself looked like until I found a blog written by a specialist of the VNIEM Corporation. And this was a blog about the SkySat-1 satellite, which you just saw on the table. That's the high-resolution American optical imaging satellite used for civilian purposes. And this guy wrote in his blog that one of these SkySat satellites had been launched piggyback with a meteor weather satellite by a Russian rocket. So again, the meteor weather satellites are built by the VNIEM Corporation. And he said in this blog that they had been very impressed with the compact design of this American satellite. And then I suddenly realized why SkySat-1 had been in the table in this article back in 2014. And I realized that what the Russians had done, they had simply copied the design of the SkySat-1 satellite and put a Russian optical payload on it. So that's probably what MK looks like, Cosmos 2525. We can be pretty sure that it looks like that. Another project that I recently discovered is called Burevestnik, which is a Russian word. It's a Russian word for a bird called a stormy petrel, if I pronounce that correctly. Petrel, not petrol, petrel. Okay. I'm pretty sure that it's a new Russian anti-satellite system. You know, back in the Soviet days, the Russians had the IS killer satellites. They also had numerous other ASAT proposals that never made it off the drawing board. But it looks like they're working on a new ASAT weapon. And I found this again, you have to be lucky with this sort of thing, it's quite by accident again. I was actually looking for information on the Matryoshka satellites. So what I did, I entered in Google NPO Lavachkin, which is the manufacturer of the Matryoshka satellites, and something like space surveillance, because that's what these satellites are probably doing. And I got this article. It's about an article dedicated to the 80th anniversary of a company called VNIT. It's actually called NEAT now. It's a company based in St. Petersburg, which builds television cameras for Russian satellites. And I saw one line there which immediately attracted my interest. It's this line here. It says, among our recent projects is a small star tracker for space systems developed by KB Tochmash. The Tochmash Design Bureau is a weapon manufacturer, and the only thing they have done related to space is to develop ASAT weapons. So that single line told me that probably the Russians are once again working on an ASAT system. And I then started looking for more information. The first thing I did is I went to the KB Tochmash website, predictably there's nothing there. Even worse, they even removed all the pages related to their publicly known military products were recently removed from the internet, because the Kremlin is clearly tightening its control of the internet, and that's just part of that effort. I think I then went to this electronic library which I just showed, e.library.ru. So I looked for a list of articles published by this Tochmash Design Bureau in recent months and years. And sure enough, I found a couple of articles that were space related. More particularly, they talked about a space background simulator at KB Tochmash. This is a vacuum chamber, and this is an optical bench that you can put inside this vacuum chamber. Of course, these were again very technical articles with lots of mathematical formulas. But what you could quite easily deduce from those articles was that this simulator is intended to simulate the interference that an ASAT weapon will have to deal with when it homes in on a target. Okay? So that's the only think this can be used for. I also started looking for more information on the star tracker, and there's lots of very technical articles about this star tracker in publications of this NEAT Design Bureau in St. Petersburg. They don't tell you for what the star tracker is going to be used, but it's obviously going to be used to determine the orientation of this ASAT weapon in space. And then the key to finding more information on this project came in a PhD dissertation, which talks about this star tracker here, and it says that it's being developed as part of a project called Burevestnik. And as soon as you have a name, you can start looking for more information. So I entered Burevestnik in this Zakupki website, the contracts, the purchases website, and indeed I found several contracts related to this project. Here again you can see the name Burevestnik. This is a contract for the delivery of this optical bench. This is the acronym for the optical bench of this space simulator to KB Tochmash, and found lots of interesting information there, which I'm not going to elaborate on today. I've written everything down on the NASA Spaceflight Forum if you're interested. I opened a new thread on this project last week, I think, so you can find all the details there. So, in short, again, you don't have to be Edward Snowden to find this kind of information on Russian military satellites. All I can conclude is that the Russians are not doing a very good job at protecting their state secrets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bart. Who needs Edward Snowden if Bart's doing all of this?
Well, I'm just an amateur, so I wonder what real spies can find out.
But I also think it's a great course in historical and investigative journalism methods, isn't it? Yes. I mean, you could apply this in so many different fields, I think. Okay, excuse me, I'm sure we have time for some questions. We'd like to start. Sven.
Just a comment, I think the NEAT organization is the one that developed the camera for Luna 3.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right, yeah. They've had a monopoly in building television cameras since the late 1950s. Yeah, that was their first space-related project, Luna 3, the satellite that made the first pictures of the far side of the moon. Very famous pictures. Yeah.
About your patents or patents, I have some Soviet patents which actually relate to control engineering in what is now Ukraine. But what struck me about them wasn't what the content was, but who held the patent. And I found that there were there's a list of 8 names, right? There are two ways in which that's done. There is normally one who is the principal investigator is at the top of the head, and it kind of goes rank order.
Yeah, but usually a list of 8-9 persons.
But sometimes it doesn't follow that, and I did a social network analysis using patent names and found links, in the way that you do, sleuthing it into different institutions. So it's just another method that you can use, is that you look at the 8 names holding the patent, and then you go into a program like Gephi, and it draws the lines, and suddenly you find different clusters of people, and they can either be professions or they can be.
Click on the names, you get.
And then you get other names. And it's it's the social network between people who are working in different institutions, and you can find different institutions that way.
It's the same on the electronic library, so you have this name of persons, and you can click on their names and you get all the articles they have recently written.
And then you click on everybody else's names, like a signed citation index. That's a good one as well. Who's citing these academic journals in their journals?
Sorry?
You use a citation index. So if you find a public document, and then you go to Google Scholar or something, and then you can see where citations of that original document pop up in other people's research, and that's another method.
Thank you. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay, shall we finish there for our lunch break? I'm going to ask you, please, could we thank Bart again for his very original bit of investigation work.